evening, everybody, and welcome to the Cambridge Union for tonight's main debate. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so delighted to see such a fantastic turnout for tonight's motion, which I think is really important that we take the time to talk about. So the motion this evening is this House would open its doors to refugees. On October 2nd, a referendum was held in Hungary on the European Union's plans to relocate refugees and migrants among member states. Whilst the referendum ultimately failed, the majority of the people who voted chose to reject relocation. And earlier this year, here in the UK, Parliament voted down an amendment that would have seen 3,000 child refugees allowed entry into the UK. So tonight, the Union is asking the question of whether we should be reconsidering our approach to the refugee crisis. If you are joining us on live stream, I'm hoping it's working, but I'm aware we might have some slight problems. Tonight's hashtag is CUSRefugees. Remember to tweet at Cambridge Union with your comments, your questions. I will be monitoring everything and I will try to read some of those out. If you would like to contribute tonight in the debate from the chamber, the ways to do so are quite simply to stand up during someone's speech and say on that point or point of information. A speaker may decide to not take your point, however, and if that is the case, please do return to your seat. We will also do 2 rounds of floor speeches, which is your chance to have your say if a point's not taken during someone's speech. Tonight, we will do that after the first pair and the third pair of speakers, as we have a 4v4 debate this evening. We will take those in proposition, opposition, and abstention of the motion. So, to tonight's debate. In proposition this evening, opening up the debate as a whole, we have Ambassador Mazen Hammoud, who is Jordan's ambassador to the UK and has been since June 2011. He's previously worked as part of Jordan's permanent mission to the UN in New York. Jordan, as I'm sure you all know, is at the forefront of the refugee crisis, with Syrian refugees representing about 20% of the country's population, and we're really delighted that the ambassador has flown in to be here this evening. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I'm honored to be here today at the Cambridge Union, a most auspicious society. I'm most privileged to be here and to be amongst those who have spoken and debated here throughout centuries of history. Thank you for giving my country, Jordan, the opportunity to be represented at this evening's debate. It comes as a recognition to the role of my country is playing in hosting 1.4 million Syrian refugees, which now constitute 20% of our population. But as I speak, remember that the results of last year's census show that there are over 10 million people who live in Jordan, of which a third are refugees. I'll talk about this as we move along. Britain maintains a central international position. It's a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and plays an active and dynamic role in all United Nations bodies. It is the second most powerful military in NATO and the 6th most powerful in the world. With a 2.85 trillion GDP, it is the world's 5th largest economy. In 2015, it stood as the 6th country in the world giving index rankings. Britain's influence is enhanced by its development aid budget, placing it 2nd in the world. And with its leading role in the Commonwealth, Britain stands as a global power with much influence and responsibilities. If we take the Syrian crisis as an example, we find that the UK has committed £2.3 billion since 2012 in response to this crisis. This support is reaching millions of people in Syria, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Iraq, and in Egypt. So far, almost £1 billion has already been spent. In addition to this financial assistance, the United Kingdom's decision last year to relocate 20,000 Syrian refugees to Britain by 2020 was received with praise and respect globally and in line with its international role and responsibilities as one of the leading nations in the world. This decision came 1 year before the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants that was adopted by the 71st session of the General Assembly less than 1 month ago. In that landmark declaration that condemns xenophobia against refugees and migrants and supports a global campaign to counter it, the international community, including this one, of course, unanimously made many commitments to both migrants and refugees alike. Let me quote you a paragraph from that declaration. We urge states that have not yet established resettlement programs to consider doing so at the earliest opportunity. Those which have already done so are encouraged to consider increasing the size of their programs. End of quote. In his remarks in the Leaders' Summit on Refugees, which led to the New York Declaration I just discussed, President Obama said, "It's a test of our international system where all nations ought to share in our collective responsibilities. Because the vast majority of refugees are hosted by just 10 countries who are bearing a very heavy burden." He added, "We've seen in America hardworking, patriotic refugees serve in our military and start new businesses and help revitalize communities. I believe refugees can make us stronger." You see, the fact that refugees cross from one border or come from one region does not make finding solutions and resources to deal with their burden either a national or a regional problem. On the contrary, addressing refugee influx challenges that are imposed is a global responsibility. One thing becomes clear in the interplay between the global and the national. In massive movements, the problem, responsibility, and solutions go beyond national and even regional borders. Many probably wonder why I speak so passionately about this issue. Let me tell you why. Jordan's debt to GDP ratio stands at around 93%. Economists suggest that had Jordan not faced a refugee crisis, it would have been at least half of that. My country is host to 1.4 million Syrian refugees. That's 20% of the population, 1 in every 5. When you add 20% more people into a country in less than a 5-year span, this is what happens. Of the 1.4 million, 1.3 million live in host communities. This is when a refugee crisis becomes a migration crisis. This is because their children need an education. Thus, over 160,000 children from Syrian refugees are in our public schools. 40,000 more will be inducted in the system very soon. Everyone needs a doctor at some point. Thus, they have access to our public medical facilities. We import 90% of our energy. This means we have to import 20% more. We are the 4th poorest country in the world in terms of water per capita. So 20% more people make a difference even for the simple instinctive human requirement of drinking water. In his remarks last week on the occasion of receiving the Peace of Westphalia Prize in Munster, Germany, His Majesty King Abdullah II of Jordan said, I quote, and this is in addition to approximately 2 million Jordanians who are also Palestinian refugees registered for decades with UNRWA, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi refugees and others from Libya and Yemen. This makes Jordan the biggest source of refugees in the world. His Majesty added, the fact is, if regional host countries were unable to fill our roles, the refugee burden would not disappear. It would simply fall elsewhere. We are facing a global crisis that demands global collective action to share the burden and support host communities and refugees alike. You will be interested to learn that we have already issued 28,000 work permits to Syrians in Jordan as part of the solution, creative solution, we are offering to deal with refugee crisis, and which was included in the Jordan Compact that was declared at the London Syria and Region Support Conference in February of this year. Our target is to provide 200,000 work permits for Syrians. Remember that our unemployment rate in Jordan is over 14%. According to a recent report, Jordan has topped the list of 10 countries of 193 in the world that host more than half of the world's refugees. The report said that those 10 countries, which collectively shelter 56% of the world's 21 million refugees, account for less than 2.5% of the global economy. The report questioned why the wealthiest countries in the world were prepared to bail out banks, develop new technologies, and fight wars, but will not find homes for 21 million refugees, which constitute 0.3% of the world's population. Be aware that according to a recent study carried out by the Jordanian government and the United Nations, the indirect economic impact on Jordan in the last 3 years alone has reached $12.37 billion. Our GDP last year was 37 billion. It's a huge number. So this country's recognition that this is a shared responsibility by not only providing substantial financial help, but by also resettling Syrian refugees is welcome. Similarly, we applaud Malta, Finland, Macedonia, Romania, Italy, Montenegro, Cyprus, Spain, Greece, France, Switzerland, Norway, Belgium, Bulgaria, Denmark, Netherlands, Austria, Hungary, Sweden, and many other countries, Serbia, Kosovo, and Germany, and the United States of America, and many countries in the world who have opened their doors to resettle refugees. My final point, ladies and gentlemen. Precision missiles are a milestone invention to control collateral damage. We must stop thinking of collateral damage in terms of death. It's time to recognize that refugees, as a result of wars, are also collateral damage. It's death in another way. Remember that woman in a camp in Greece who held onto her family photographs, heard her children cry on the phone, and who said, "My breath is my children. Every day I am dying 10, 20, 30 times." You see, if countries do not participate in the burden of hosting refugees, waging wars in distant lands become easier by relying on the norm of neighboring countries to bear their burden. But if the international community recognizes its responsibility of sharing that burden, then their vested interest in promoting and safeguarding international peace and stability becomes a priority. As opposed to waging war or participating in subversive activities that could create a refugee crisis for which they would have to bear no responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to the Ambassador for opening our debate tonight. And now we turn to our opposition bench for the first time this evening, and we begin with Godfrey Bloom, who was the MEP for Yorkshire and the Humber from 2004 to 2014. He has previously made the case that immigration is bad for Britain at the Oxford Union, over at the other side, and tonight he is representing the Mises Institute. Godfrey.
Disappointed you quoted that because I'd tell you not to do so. Anyway, moving right on. I'm also a representative of the Mises Institute, one of the foremost libertarian institutes in the world. I believe in open borders. I believe in free movement of people. I believe in small government. I think you can hear me come to, I'm sure you can. So we have a situation here where I believe in the concept of free movement of people, open borders, small government, low taxation. I'm a libertarian. I'm a classical liberal, if you would prefer the term. For those of you, very few of you, I suspect, very few who didn't buy my autobiography, you will also know that I married into a Polish refugee family. My father-in-law was a tank commander with the 4th Polish Armored Division and fought all the way through Normandy. I need no lesson in history, I'm afraid, here. I know the good that immigrants have done and refugees have done, especially here in this part of the world in the Fens, in basis of our economy has been built on protection of property rights under the law. That's what drove the Industrial Revolution. That's what brought us out of the medieval era, if you will, where life was nasty, brutish and short. It was that wonderful thing, protection under the law, the principles of English law in a free society. And that's the reason, up until the last 50 years, that we have one of the most successful economies on the face of the globe. Sadly, and I speak as a libertarian, classical liberal, we've moved away from that in the late 1940s. We moved away from that, and I think that's a shame. We moved into something which is called welfareism. We have a welfare state, social welfare and corporate welfare, which of course is economically unsustainable, as we know. We can see from the figures. We have this extraordinary situation where we are considered to be a rich nation, which we judge by GDP, which of course is possibly the most absurd way of judging any economy. We have, in the United Kingdom, the second biggest debt on the face of the globe. We are more indebted nationally than any other country in the world, with the exception of Japan. So we are in debt. We're living on tick. We're on the chucky. So we don't have very much money, and it has gone worse and worse and worse because it's borrowed. The borrowing now, I could talk about trillions, but you wouldn't understand it because it's beyond the concept of human imagination. Let me just explain it to you if I may. If you are British in this audience, your share per capita of the national debt is £80,000 for every single family that you have. £80,000. Unsustainable. It can't be paid off. And our private debt is almost the same. It's getting as bad. And you're going to feel the benefit, the disbenefit of that very soon, aren't you? Every undergraduate here is getting more in debt every year because we cannot find enough money to educate our own people at our own universities. And we have this crazy system, in my view, of welfareism, where the state now is responsible for almost every aspect of our lives. It's responsible for our education. It's responsible for our health, our sick pay, our unemployment pay, pensions. There is no aspect of our lives which is not interfered with or the government does not consider to be its remit. Even to the extent they tell us what the size of our puddings ought to be, whether we have sugar in our pot, whether we have a smoke at our local pub. The government has taken over every aspect of our lives. Well, that's okay if that's what you want and it seems that people do. I don't want it. I'm a libertarian. I don't want it. But it seems you like this. Everybody seems to like politicians making the decisions for them. I don't know why, but you do. Society seems to want it. But the problem is all that costs money. And of course, the protection of property rights becomes difficult because your education system, your pension system and your health system are actually owned by proxy on your behalf by the government. Our public spaces, our beaches, our public squares are owned all the time on your behalf. So it makes it very difficult to have protection of property rights under the principles of law. So not only are we the most crowded pieces of real estate on the face of the planet, something like 465 people in England per square kilometre, second only in Europe to Holland, are one of the most densely populated countries, advanced economies in the world. We're also one of the most indebted. And of course, sadly, and this isn't about compassion, we all feel compassionate, we all feel dreadfully sorry for this situation, it's ghastly, and some of it is created, I'm sorry to say, by the CIA collusion with the Foreign Office to destabilise many of these countries quite deliberately. And for that, I think, is disgraceful. But we are where we are. But where in the world is there not a constant supply of refugees? His Excellency has spoken about Syria, and for which we all feel deep shame and remorse, I'm quite sure. But now we have Venezuela with its disastrous experimentation with socialism, which was oil rich, now has starving children. We have the persecution of Christians in Nigeria. We have the persecution of Christians and Ahmadiyya Muslims in the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, the Horn of Africa. it seems that there is no limit. There is no limit to the amount of refugees that could come. I would ask you to just consider the motion, which it passed them by at the other place and didn't understand the motion. The motion is quite specific. An open door policy. Yes, we have a responsibility. Yes, we should take some responsibility. But if you look at the Somali family, the other day it was in the newspapers, 7 or 8 people in North London in an £800,000 or £900,000 house, which is actually the property of the ratepayer of North London. Don't you agree with me that £900,000 would have gone a damn sight further in Somalia than it does in North London? So none of this makes any sense. And I'll leave you with one thought before you vote. One thought. When you left your flat, when you left your college rooms, when you left your house, did you lock your door when you came out? Did you? Look at your own house. You did, didn't you? Everybody here locked their door. So if you vote for this motion, I would put an old word there, an old wonderful Victorian word. You're a humbug. You're a humbug. If you locked your door, you don't believe in an open door policy. I commend you to vote against this motion.
Thank you very much, Godfrey, for opening our opposition bench. And I apologise for referencing the speech in a way which you'd preferred I did not. We now turn to our first round of floor speeches for this evening. Floor speeches, if you could limit them to at most a minute's length, please. We will do proposition, opposition, and abstentions. If you are chosen, please can you state your name and your college first for the record. Okay, so do we have a speech in proposition of the motion at all? Yes, the lady at the back there.
Anna Walker, Emmanuel College. I agree with you. I think there was a period of time of plausible kind of deniability in terms of letting in more refugees. I think if we had pumped more money into Jordan and other countries that are so generously, as the ambassador said, hosting so many Syrians, instead of London, which a few months ago was hosting 20 Syrian refugees, which I think is appalling even as an Australian. We have the most brutal immigration policy in the world. We had the opportunity to help neighbouring countries. We didn't, which I now think we're definitely past the point of being able to say that we need to give more support and now need to actually finally act on that and finally take in more Syrians.
Thank you very much, Anna. Do we have a point in opposition of the motion at all? I realise it might be a hard sell in this chamber. Okay, do we have a point in... Oh, we do have a point in opposition. There we are.
I'm Keir, I'm from Selwyn. I would just say that in terms of libertarianism, there is actually a lot of theoretical basis for what Godfrey Bloom is saying. For instance, there's the work of Professor Hans-Hermann Hoppe from the University of Las Vegas, I think. And what he says is... What he says is the idea is immigration is not the same as trade. You need two parties, you need a bilateral agreement for trade. The thing about immigration is it's not some mutually beneficial transaction, it's not wanted by both parties, and also the problem with the state is it takes over public property, it owns roads, waterways, airports, and so on and so forth, and lots of other public property besides, which is the state claims, but is really owned by the domestic tax-paying population. And so it's surely absurd not to actually consult the population on whether they want immigration or not, perhaps through a referendum.
Thank you very much. And finally, do we have a point in abstention of the motion at all? Yes, at the back there. Don't worry, Kate's got the mic.
Switch on? Yeah, okay. Jack McConnell from King's College. A 5-figure death toll, 4,000 civilian deaths, 7.6 million suffering from malnutrition, 14.1 million who are food insecure, and crucially, 3.15 million who are internally displaced. This is in Yemen. I recognize what Jordan does for Syrian refugees. Jordan has followed Saudi Arabia into war in Yemen, has contributed 6 fighter jets, and is reported to have replaced the Emirates' ground troops in the south of the country. He talked about shared responsibility. Children's lives have been ruined, education has been gotten rid of in large parts of the country. Doctors Without Borders, hospitals have been bombed indiscriminately. Daniel Zeichner's party here disagrees with this war that's going on in Yemen, so on the same side as you. So I can deal with the hypocrisy. And you can try and explain away the civilian deaths as some kind of strategic gains, and I'm sure these arguments have value. But what I'm afraid I can't really accept is the Jordanian ambassador standing up here and moralizing about refugees when we need to be asking him about his country's policy in Yemen. Thank you.
Would you like to respond? Of course. Yes, please do.
Point accepted, and thank you for raising it, actually. But I would just tell you, we all have to get our facts right. You said 6 fighter jets. That's incorrect. We don't have. Jordan is not a rich country that has fighter jets to give away to countries. I think the total number we have is maybe 20 or 25 aircrafts. We don't give 6 aircrafts to any country. I think there's 1 aircraft there, if I'm correct, and it was never ever used. I think when you want to discuss coalition in Yemen, I think you should leave Jordan away from this and mention all the other countries that are actually contributing militarily there. Jordan is a very, very, has a military that is not a very powerful one. And we don't have aircrafts to share in any war. And this is why we have kept ourselves out from the war that's next door to us. So these numbers that you just mentioned, I'm sure you read them somewhere. I'm sure you were told from somewhere. But as an ambassador, I'm just telling you that's not correct. But I think that when you should talk about such a matter, you should really talk about the countries that are really contributing militarily there and making that war happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to everyone who contributed in that floor round. We now return to our main debate and back to the proposition bench. Up next, we have Josie Norton, who is one of the co-founders of the charity Help Refugees. The charity, as I understand, grew out of the movement of the hashtag Help Calais, which they started on Twitter to help raise awareness and find funds and goods in response to the refugee crisis, which is currently ongoing across the channel. Josie.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. This is a huge, huge honour to be speaking here tonight, so thank you so much. I'm talking to you tonight not as a politician and not as an official, but just as a regular person, just like any of you who has had an experience in this last year in this crisis, and it's completely changed my world. And I'm just going to sort of tell you my story, because that will kind of inform you as to why I agree that we should be opening our doors to refugees. So about a year and 2 months ago, I, like many of you, was watching the unfolding crisis on the news, seeing images of people washing up on the beaches of Greece, and images of people in Calais living in really, really terrible conditions. And I had sort of thought of myself as a political person. I'd share stuff on Facebook and thought that I was doing my bit, and I suddenly felt like that's probably not actually enough and I should maybe do something. So me and some friends decided that we would raise £1,000 and 1 van load of the most essential items for Calais, because it was the closest place to us. And we started a hashtag, at the time was Help Calais. And we ended up raising £56,000 in a week. We also started an Amazon wish list of these most wanted items rather than people just finding like their old tent in an attic. Got some rooms at a big yellow storage in North London, and we suddenly were receiving 7,000 packages of aid a day. So firstly, this signified actually people really do care, people are human, people do have compassion, but also was a massive responsibility that we knew really not what to do with at all. So suddenly we were like having to get big groups of volunteers in, learn how to pack, learn what pallets were, learning about haulage, and then also realised that we'd not actually even been to Calais, and we had all this stuff and all this money, and we probably had a responsibility to do the right thing with it. After work on a Friday evening at 6 o'clock, me and 3 friends got in the car and drove to France and went to Calais. And what I found when I got there will stay with me for the rest of my life. We arrived essentially at a big field. There were 5,000 people living there, You can get the train from King's Cross to Calais in an hour. So this is an hour from my front door. 5,000 people living in a field. There were a lot of children running around. Everyone was living in a really crap festival tent. Loads of people didn't have shoes on. They didn't have access to go to the toilet. People were hungry. And I just couldn't believe that I was in Europe. And, 5 minutes down the road, there were people probably eating caviar or whatever. Like this, I couldn't, the juxtaposition was just like really too much for me. I expected to find the UN there. I expected to find the Red Cross there. I expected to find Oxfam there. No one was there. So together, we joined up with a French organisation called L'Auberge de Migrants. And we rented a huge warehouse, and we began a distribution system. So we started to distribute sleeping bags, tents, clothes, shoes, food. We were very quickly serving about 5,000 to 6,000 meals a day. We started a shelter building program. By Christmas, we had housed all the women and children. And actually, one other point that I should tell you about the first day when I arrived, I met a boy who was 14 from Sudan. And he was dressed super, super cool. He had like this really cool Adidas jumper on, and I was like, wow, your outfit's amazing. And and I was asking him about his story, and he was telling me that he'd come over on a boat, and that when they were on the boat, they would always pack, the smugglers pack too many people onto the boat so they can make more money. And when the boat starts to sink and they get into the middle of the sea, they just chuck people off the boat who are on their own or who are old. And so he told me that he was so frightened that he clung onto the boy who was sitting next to him, who was also on his own. They were on their own because they had no family left. And they clung onto each other for dear life, and that's why they weren't chucked off the boat, and they were now together in Calais. And I said to him, like, what do you want? Like, I'll get you anything. I can go and get you another cool Adidas jumper. And he just said that I want my mum. And that, like, we all need to remember that these are people, that we can all sit here and talk about the fact that, we need to protect ourselves, we need to protect our economy, but if we want to protect ourselves at the cost of ignoring human beings who have lost all their family and have nothing, then I don't want to be part of that economy. Anyway, so we began to work in Calais, and as we continued to work in Calais and distribute, we discovered that there were a lot of unaccompanied children in the camp. Right now in Calais, there are 1,022 unaccompanied children who are by themselves. The youngest of them is 8 years old. Both the French government and the British government know that those children are there, and no one has done anything to help them. If it weren't for our teams of volunteers who provide them with food, shelter, like a really crap excuse for something to do in the form of a youth club, they would have nothing. And they are so desperate to find some kind of safety that they are forced to try and get on trains, to try and get on lorries, and to try and get on ferries to get to the UK. People might ask why they're trying to get to the UK. They're trying to get to the UK because a lot of them have got family here. I know a boy from Syria who's 13 who lost all of his family in a bomb in Syria, and he has an uncle in London. So if I was that 13-year-old boy, I would do everything in my power to get to my uncle in London. So that's what he's trying to do. In the last 6 months, 3 children with family in the UK who were in Calais on their own have lost their lives trying to get here because we don't have a place there for people to process their claim to live here. The rest of the children probably would claim asylum in France, but they can't because there is no office there with French officials wanting to take them in. And the French police, unfortunately, don't treat people the way they should be. I myself have seen a French CRS policeman kick the back of a bike of a 10-year-old Syrian girl who was just riding her bike. Like, this is not a situation that we should be living in. We also, as an organisation, back in October, began to work in Greece. In Lesbos, we set up a kitchen, which was in the Moria camp. So when people arrived in Lesbos, if they'd survived, they would be taken to Moria camp, where they have to register to then have the rest of their journey through Europe and end up wherever they're going to end up. We would provide people with hot meals, we would provide them with warm clothes. A lot of these people might have lost people on the journey, so our volunteers would be meeting people that are incredibly vulnerable. And again, all the stories that the volunteers have just remind you that this is a human crisis. And we can all talk until the cows come home about, you know, we should have fixed the problem where it started, we should, you know, all these things that should have happened, but the point is that this is happening and that we all have an obligation to help. My organisation, Help Refugees, we're now essentially the largest distributor of aid in Calais, and we work in 22 camps in Greece. We've also sent 2 ambulances to the White Helmets who work in Syria, and we work in Lebanon, and we work in Turkey, just doing really basic emergency aid: food, clothes, shelter. And on my journey, all the people that I've met, they're not something to be afraid of. We see in the newspapers images of like crowds of young men angry coming to try and get our jobs. That's just not the reality. In Greece right now, there are 60,000 refugees who are basically trapped inside Greece in makeshift camps. 65% of them are women and children. 40% of them are children. They're all out of education. They're all malnourished. There are 9,000 pregnant women. I have met families who babies have passed away quite soon after being born because it's too hot, because they don't have, the mother hasn't been nourished properly. This is very, very real. This could be any of us, and I think that's something that we all really need to remember. If you were just looking outside your window one night and you saw a child on its own crying, or you saw a family with children or alone, cold, with nothing to eat, I guarantee you that every single person in this room would say, "Are you okay? Would you like to come in? Let me give you something to eat, and we'll work out tomorrow where you're going to end up living, where you're going to get a job," all that stuff. But in that immediate moment, you would all take these people in and offer them a kind hand. And I think that we have to look at this situation like that. And I know that when I go to bed at night, when I look in the mirror, I want to think that I'm a person that helped people, and I don't want to think that I'm a person that turned people away and may be responsible for terrible things happening to them. And so I think that is ultimately why we have to be accepting refugees into our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josie, for that valuable insight. So we now turn back to the opposition bench this evening. And up next we have Alistair MacLeod, who began his career as a stockbroker in the 1970s on the stock exchange. And he now works as head of research at Gold Money and writes his own blog, Finance and Economics, to demystify the financial world for all of us. Alistair.
Thank you, Madam President. Is this working? Can you hear me? Good, okay. The proposition is effectively for unfettered immigration for refugees. I look at this from a businessman's point of view, and that's the angle that I'm going to take. My heart tells me that we have an enormous responsibility for what has happened in the Middle East, and not just in the Middle East, but also in North Africa. That is the source of our refugee problem. We have responsibility for it. And I think Jordan has actually done a fantastic job of being a haven of stability in a sea of troubles and giving home to refugees. Now, I know we've actually dipped in our wallets and helped Jordan by giving Jordan money. You could argue that that is actually not good enough. It's passing the buck. Perhaps it is passing the buck. My heart tells me that there is a very, very good case for an open door policy. But that is my heart, it's not my head. My head is telling me something very different. We are a country which is crowded. We're a country which has specific needs. We have a country which has a government of whichever hue who would have difficulty organising light refreshment for some undergraduates. So the idea that we can actually absorb unlimited quantities of people, we have to dismiss that. Let's look at it from a business point of view. I have two offices. I have one in Jersey and one in Toronto. Now in Jersey, we've actually got an immigration problem. Not many people are aware of this, but the taxi industry is virtually dominated by Scotsmen. Now, I don't have a problem with it because I'm Scots myself, but I can understand that might be a problem. More seriously, Toronto is a very interesting case. Over 50% of the population of Toronto are immigrants of one sort or another. I mean, I'm not going to differentiate between immigrants and refugees because I think that's a trite way of categorizing people. 50% of the population in Toronto are immigrants. In my office, we have 25 people. And of those 25, only 5 are born of Canadian parents. The rest are American, obviously, Russian, one Brit when I'm over there. We've got Ukrainians, we've got Italians, we've got Chinese, we've got Indians, we've even got one Ugandan. This is a very satisfactory mix. It works incredibly well. We have got the best brains for our business. Our business is cutting-edge financial technology, so we need the best people. So my problem at coming in at this from the British businessman's point of view is that we must have immigration. But given that it's limited, we have to choose who we let in. My heart tells me it should be a very wide remit, but my head tells me that cannot be the case. Now, I think, we need to sort of think quite hard about who we let in. Now, one of my, if you like, sort of pet loves is that we should offer university education as much as possible and as widely as possible to everyone from wherever. As long as they qualify, we should let them in for a university education. I think that's important. And I'm sure that the audience here are fully aware of the contribution that many foreign students make to the overall university. I think that's an important point. I would go further than that and say that those people should be given the opportunity to stay. We have educated them. They have absorbed our ethics, our ethos. If they choose to stay, I think we should move as much as we can to help them to stay. Now, I know this is more expansionary than current government policy. I think also that if they go back home, that is extremely valuable to us because they take our ethics, our ethos, they take our tolerance, our acceptance. And that, I think, is a very important point. It stands, as a businessman, it actually stands us in very, very good stead. Because when I go and trade with someone in a foreign country, and I find he's been to Cambridge, Oxford, or one of the lesser universities, I think that it really is enormously helpful. It is very good for business. So that is something I would encourage. I think the other problem that we have is in terms of provision of services. If you look at housing, there is no way we can keep up with the demand for houses from the current population, let alone a rapidly expanded population. Now, the problem there is that all of you here, unless you've got the bank of mum and dad, you're going to have to pay back whatever it cost to educate you here, and you have also got to save for a deposit to buy a house. But house prices continue to run away because there is not the supply of houses. We can hope for a supply of houses, but it ain't going to happen, I can tell you. They will expand as much as they can, but it will not satisfy the demand. So if we have unfettered immigration, there is absolutely no doubt that it would put enormous strains on the housing stock, and unless you got the bank of mum and dad, I think you would have great difficulty in managing to buy your own home. And again, when it comes to public services, in theory, we should be able to make our public services efficient enough to absorb a far higher level of population. But that's never going to happen. By the nature of things, hospitals are bureaucracies. You can imagine a hospital bed. You've probably got 1/10 of a nurse, 1/50th of a doctor, and about 4 bureaucrats standing round it. That is the way the national health system works. It's accountability, accountability, box ticking, and all the rest of it. It must be pretty awful for the people working at it with if you like, a desire to help people like the doctors and nurses. But that is the way it is. Can we change it? We should be able to change it, but we can't. We cannot create the room for people to come in from abroad on an unfettered basis. Now, this is a real problem. This hurts my heart, but my head tells me that that is actually the situation.
I just wondered what you, so a lot of the time when I'm meeting refugees in camps in France or in Greece or Turkey, they're actually doctors and nurses, and I think right now there's a lot of talk about hospitals not being up to standard, and there aren't enough doctors and nurses, so surely that is something that we massively welcome to have people who have these skills coming into our country and helping us.
I think you raise a very good point. These are amongst the people who I think we should prioritise in terms of coming in, because we need doctors, we need nurses here. But equally, we must consider the other side of it, and that is, do they need the doctors? Do they need the nurses? So, well, okay, but I mean, I would take the point, and I think that where we have a shortage of qualified people, then that is something that we should be able to give some leeway on. So I would agree with that point entirely. I mean, the other thing about all this is that, if you just let people in, you're going to have a backlash at the end of the day. And we're already seeing this in Germany. We've seen it in Sweden. We see it in Hungary. The most terrible problems that Italy and Greece face. That is something, obviously, which there is no way that the British public is going to permit. I think it's going to be hard enough for us to get the people in that we need in order to keep up with the world, the outside world, in terms of commerce, as it is, without having an open door policy. And one of the other points which is probably worth mentioning is, and this always gets raised by politicians in particular, we need the lower paid workers, we need the people who are the fruit pickers, we need the people in the care industry, we need people in the hospitals, to sort of do the heavy lifting for minimum wage and all the rest of it. Well, yeah, I mean, these businesses lobby politicians so that they can continue to get people at minimum wage to do these jobs on the basis that no Brit would do it. I would put it to you that these businesses are basically badly run. And the reason that they can't pay more is because they don't invest in their own business. They don't actually look at making their businesses more efficient. I mean, they've got loads of middle management. Middle management does nothing. You can get rid of them. Empower the person on the shop floor. Empower the person who is actually dealing at the front, with the problems, providing the service. Empower them. Make them responsible and pay them something decent. And I think if you make the job more interesting in that way, we can actually satisfy the requirement for those low-paid jobs. And if you look at the farming industry, for example, before the First World War, you would have, in one of these fields here, you would have 50 to 100 people bringing in the wheat, bringing in the hay, and all the rest of it. Now, nowadays, it's all combine harvesters, and it's combine harvesters, and it's 2 people. So we can actually take those businesses which are inefficient and make them more efficient. Don't ask me how to do it, I'm not a specialist, but I do know that that is progress. So I would I would suggest very strongly that the proposition is impractical, and on that basis, it should be rejected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alistair, for bringing the business side of the argument for us this evening. We're now going to continue on with our main debate, and we'll do another round of floor speeches after the third pair of speakers tonight. So back to the proposition bench, and up next we have Robert Vercake. He's a freelance journalist and a writer specialising in legal affairs and security. He's the author of the book Jihadi John, The Making of a Terrorist, and he also recently wrote for The Independent on how Angela Merkel's open door policy could help protect Germany from long-term terrorism. Robert.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this most important issue. When we think about the humanitarian crisis engulfing Europe, we immediately drawn to Germany, where Angela Merkel has already established an open-door refugee policy. Perhaps the first one since the end of the Second World War, when conversely just about everybody was trying to get as far away from Germany as it was feasibly possible to do. So how is it working today? How is this open refugee policy working today? If you read the tabloid newspapers, you would be forgiven for thinking that German cities are plagued by gangs of Arabs pillaging shopping centres and sexually assaulting German maidens. But that isn't the reality. The reality is that the majority of Germans welcome their refugees. They flock to the railway stations where the refugees are coming into the country, and they bring with them presents, food, and other gifts, and the most important gift of all, the message of welcome. So, in Britain, we too are defying the tabloid headlines. We aren't a nation that thinks we're being swamped by refugees. We're not that hard-hearted. Do you remember when the Byron Burgers, the food chain, the one favoured by George Osborne, decided it would invite all its foreign workforce to a bogus meeting and then shot them to the immigration authorities? What was the Londoners' response to that? London's response was to get onto the streets waving placards saying, "We love refugees." British people do love refugees. Up and down the country, we're supporting refugees all the time. 800 miles away, on the Scottish island of Bute, 12 Syrian families have been relocated. And what was the locals' response? Not that was carried in the tabloid newspapers. They were moaning and complaining about the weather. No, their response was to have a whip round so they could afford to pay for an imam to get on the Caledonian Brain ferry and hold Friday prayers. But that's perhaps only half the story. How is our government dealing with the refugee crisis? Well, there was a time when, of course, virtually every persecuted minority in Europe was beating a path to this country. From Dutch Protestants to Huguenot Calvinists, German Jews, Russian Jews, Portuguese Jews who brought with them fish and chips, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, a guy called Alex Ignatius, who designed probably the most famous motor car in the world, the Mini. But that's not the situation today. We do not have an open refugee policy, an open-door refugee policy. We have closed our doors to refugees. We are sitting on an island hoping it will all go away. Last year, 1.3 million refugees made asylum claims in Europe. How many did we accept? We took 38,000, half of whom are probably going to be rejected. But I don't say that we should welcome refugees in this country just so that we can all enjoy a warm, glowing feeling of self-righteous humanitarianism. I say there is a real benefit because there is so much at stake in inviting refugees to this country. I have argued, and I'm going to argue again, that if you want to defeat the greatest threat this country has faced since the Second World War, and I'm talking about Islamist terrorism, then we need to invite refugees into this country, because to do that, we will defeat terrorism. We defeat terrorism by showing the world we are not at war with Islam. We will show the world that we will provide safety and haven for the victims of Assad's torture chambers or the Islamic State's death camps. We will bring refugees into this country who will strengthen our own communities who already distrust their government. We will make those communities stronger and more willing to cooperate with our security services and thereby help the intelligence services gather information and disrupt terror plots. It's a win-win situation. When I put those arguments in writing in the summer in an article I wrote for The Independent and suggested that Angela Merkel's open-door refugee policy would make Germans stronger and safer in the long run, I received some of the vilest abuse I've ever received for writing anything. I just wanted to share some of that with you. So this article received 36,000 shares and 1,000 comments, most of them abusive, nearly all of them negative. But it really does show just how toxic and divisive this debate has become. So, first one was from someone called Arsenal163. Wow, just wow. This is the most ignorant liberal piece of trash I have ever read. Europe needs to focus on Europe. We have no need to appease Muslims. If they don't like what we do, they can go back to their deserts. Helen, 435. Is The Independent published from inside Broadmoor? Awful. Banished, 378. The day of the noose is coming for all these lefty enablers. Cuckolds like him are as dangerous as the jihadis. Muppet movie. I really hope so. People who write this stuff should be the first that are rounded up come the revolution. Anonymous. Signed up just to say how terrible this article is and how much damage opinions like this are doing. Bruno. He spent too long with members of the death cult and he's been brainwashed into their warped ways of thinking. Andy R. Gah! This man must have shares in KY Jelly to part his cheek so readily. Paul Charnock by email. We don't want fucking Muslim scum in here in the first place, you twat. 8 hours later, the American audience came online and the abuse continued. Walter P. Chrysler. Don't piss on my leg and tell me it's raining. Freud's wet dream. Robert Vercake, your parents need to sue the Board of Education because it's scientifically impossible for you to be born this stupid. But then something happened. The article was published in an online German magazine, and the tone suddenly changed. And I received a particular poignant response from someone called Karanas. And he or she summed up a lot of what the Germans felt about their Chancellor's immigration policy. Yes, humanity takes risks. Nevertheless, humanity is our biggest weapon and our biggest shield. Thank you very much for writing that article. Greetings from Würzburg, Germany. Now, Würzburg was the scene of a terror incident in which an Afghan refugee attacked 4 train passengers with an axe, injuring them. So his or her response was particularly poignant. And this week, I was reminded of perhaps how sensible the Germans are, or how, in fact, this kind of argument does work. Because there was a security scare. A German in Leipzig had gone on the run, allegedly planning to blow up a German airport. Been on the run for 3 days before he was captured. And do you know who captured him? It wasn't the German security forces. It was 3 Syrian refugees who'd recognized his picture and turned him into the authorities. So yes, Angela Merkel is taking the biggest political risk of her career. And I would argue that Theresa May must do the same thing, because far too much is at stake than short-term political reputations. What refugees have made this country great. We don't want to be the Donald Trump of Europe. When we look at our politicians, we want to think of Oskar Schindler, not Byron Burgers. So I would say that we should honor our history. We should open our doors to refugees. And I repeat what Karanis from Würzburg said. Yes, humanity takes risks, but humanity is our biggest shield and our biggest weapon. I commend the motion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for that fine speech. I now turn back to the opposition bench. And up next, we have James Dellingpole, who's a journalist, an author, and a broadcaster who has written for a number of publications, including the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, and the Spectator. James.
Madam President, my Cambridge chums. Is anyone here going to vote against the motion, by the way? I mean, it seems to be pretty secure. I quite understand your powerful urge to vote with the motion tonight. After all, we live in an age of conspicuous compassion, of virtue signaling. And what matters is to vote for things that make you feel good, which look good, not things which are actually going to make the world a better place and improve people's lives. When you look at the refugee issue, you naturally think, this is not a crisis, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for me to show the world that I care, that I'm not one of those nasty little Englanders, that I'm not one of those people like the people on this side of the argument who talk about horrid stuff like business and economics and stuff. I'm not one of those nasty American types who sends nasty emails to Robert. I'm one of the good guys. Well, tonight, my Cambridge friends, for a change, I would like you to think not of yourselves, but of the people that you are purporting to be trying to help. I'm talking about the refugees. And not just the refugees, but also the countries that they come from. Take the most obvious example, Syria. Syria has a population of around 20 million, currently half of which is displaced. That's 10 million people without homes. I think we can all agree that's a dire situation for those poor people. Where are we going to house them all? Well, Jude Law has offered to take in some. That's very kind of him. He's kept very quiet since his offer. I've seen no evidence that he's actually followed through on this. We also know that J.K. Rowling, Stan Collymore, the footballer, Bob Geldof, they've too piled in with some offers. But even if you add in Yvette Cooper and Ed Balls, I still think that's not enough homes to house all these people. And we also have to ask ourselves, would it really be actually good for these refugees to come here? Would it not be a cruel and unusual punishment to house some of them in Ed Balls and Yvette Cooper's house? I think it might. But more than that, do these people really want to be in this cold, alien country of ours? Wouldn't they rather be in the land of their birth, the land of their culture, where their ancestors are buried, where they speak the same language? I think we can all agree that in an ideal world, that is where they would most like to be, their home. We sometimes get very arrogant about Britain, and rightly so, because it is a beautiful country with some fine universities. We're at the second finest of them at the moment, and you've done very well to get here. I'm proud of you on behalf of your parents. It's really, really good. It's a lovely country, but there are other countries which are lovely too. Syria, for example, has been through some beautiful periods in its time. The Umayyad Mosque is one of the great wonders of the world. You've got the Crusader castles, the Crac des Chevaliers. You've got the beaches in the south. You've got the ruins of Palmyra, which, as we know, have been recently all but destroyed by ISIS. It would be wonderful if all these displaced peoples could one day find their home again back in Syria. How do we do this? Well, currently Syria is at war. But wars do not last forever. We're almost 5 years into the hideous war in Syria. Perhaps it'll last 5 years more, but we know because from experience that one day the war will be over. And when that war is over, Syria will need rebuilding. It will need to get its economy back. How do we help it get its economy back? Well, one thing we don't do is cream off the brightest, the best, the most energetic of the Syrian population, the ones who manage to work the system in order to get themselves rehoused in Europe. We are taking away all the talent that country needs to rebuild itself. But there is actually a better way, a better solution for this. One I've ripped off shamelessly from a professor from the other place, a Professor Paul Collier, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at Oxford. And he proposes that what we do is we incubate the recovery in Syria by enabling the displaced peoples in refugee camps in countries like Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon. And I salute all the work that Jordan's done. I don't think it was fair, the criticism Jordan had. I've been to Jordan myself and had a very happy time there. I think Jordan is doing great work. The problem at the camps run by the United Nations in these countries, where, by the way, about 5 million of the displaced Syrians currently find themselves, 5 million out of 10 million. The problem is not the standards of, not the conditions. They're quite well fed and quite well housed relative to the bombed out towns they've left or relative to much of sub-Saharan Africa. The problem is their complete lack of autonomy. Many of them are unable to work. You've got teachers who are unable to teach. You've got fathers, traditionally the head of the family in Arab cultures, unable to provide for their children. And what's happening is horrible things, like the young men with nothing better to do find themselves drifting across the border to join armed groups. You find some of the girls turning to prostitution. That is not a happy state of affairs for these refugees. I quite understand why countries like Jordan have strict rules on whether these people are allowed to work or not, and I applaud the fact that 200,000 work permits are going to be planned. But we're talking about 5 million people. 200,000 work permits is a drop in the ocean. What we need to do, what the nations of the West need to do, is to enable these displaced populations in these refugee camps to be able to form work units where they're able to set up businesses, to export to Europe and perhaps the US and the rest of the world, so that when the time comes, when the war is over in Syria, these businesses can be transplanted back to Syria, where these people need to be. I don't know how many of you have been aware of this solution, but I hope you agree that it's something that is intellectually appealing as well as emotionally appealing. We've heard a lot from your side about emotions, and I agree, emotions are very important, but thinking is important too. And you are, after all, some of the brightest and best people in the world. I think you should use your intellects rather than always thinking in that kind of me, I care, I really do way. And I'm afraid I encounter this problem at the other place as well. Oxford's just as bad. I really do wish you would think about solutions rather than always going with your heart, going with the emotional option. If you want to play the emotional game, by all means support the motion. You will be doing what Professor Collier calls following the intellectually lazy feel-good policy for the bien-pensant. If you want to use your brains as well as your hearts, I urge you to reject it for the good of the refugees themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for that fine speech. So we now turn to the second of our floor speech rounds, again in proposition, opposition and abstention of the motion. Again, please state your name and your college before you speak, just so we can keep a full record. So, do we have a speech in proposition of the motion at all? Yes, the gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Rufus Giordano, Christ College. I'd like to pick up on a really good point that Josie made about the fact that an economy is only successful if people are being helped by it. Now, the opposition have asked us to use our intellects tonight, and I'm not going to use mine, I'm going to use Charles Darwin's. It's appropriate that I'm coming from Christ because in our third court, there's a little statue of him. And actually, in Charles Darwin's Ascent of Man, he says that the success of our species is due not just to competition, but also due to cooperation, sympathy, and fairness, not just the bitter competition brought about by libertarian policies. Because the point is that if we build council houses, we don't have housing crises. If we fund our NHS, it can withstand the pressure placed on it. If we respect our workers' rights and stop forcing them to compete for lower and lower wages, then there's less incentive for immigration into this country. All of these things cause growth, and we can grow ourselves out of debt and grow ourselves out of a deficit. But more importantly, because it's all about people, we help people. And when people are helped, and when they are content with their lives, then parties such as UKIP, represented here tonight, and the xenophobia that they stoke in our country would wither and die. But the point is that we're successful as a species when we help one another. And a good start would be to show some humanity, our shield, as the proposition has put it, by opening our doors to refugees.
Thank you very much for that contribution. Do we have a speech in opposition of the motion at all? Yes, at the back there.
Hello, I'm Ollie, I'm from Robinson. I'd like to pick on a point that Robert made about this idea of Arab men sexually assaulting people in Germany as pure tabloid fiction. In fact, I believe a few people in this room even laughed at this ridiculous concept. I just want to give some figures, facts from 10 days of German migrant crimes in January this year. 16-year-old boy raped in Wolfsburg City Hall. 13-year-old girl sexually assaulted near a railway station in Ellwagen. 3 girls sexually assaulted at a swimming pool in Ausbach. 15-year-old girl raped at a railway station in Wuppertal. Attempted gang rape of a 12-year-old girl in Gelsenkirchen. It goes on, and I haven't even mentioned the women sexually assaulted and attacked in Cologne. Now, I consider myself both to be a liberal feminist and a compassionate person. In fact, I support us taking the children who are currently suffering in Calais and bringing them to the UK. And of course, I'm not saying that all refugees, or the majority of refugees, or most refugees are committing these heinous acts. But we have to be honest with ourselves. And that just maybe an open door refugee policy, where we open our doors to over 20 million people, especially when our current government's policy on integration is poor, might not be the most sensible of ideas.
Yes, the ambassador has a point.
Very brief comments. First of all, I congratulate you on your comments. And I just want to reinforce what you said. And this is exactly what we're trying to do in Jordan. 200,000 job offers for them to remain in Jordan, for them to have dignity, to make money, to raise their families, to create their businesses, and to take them back to Syria. And this is why, we have our new free trade agreement with Europe, the revision of the rules of contact, to support Jordanian businesses that employ Syrians, and for Syrians who are making their own business to be able to thrive and to have their economy. So what we're doing in Jordan is to keep them there. Dignified, their last resort is for them to go abroad. And this is the entire concept, is to keep them in the region and not travel abroad. And just, if you would allow me very, very briefly, I might have not been clear in the last time about, it was a political issue, Syria and Yemen, but it's for all of your interest. Jordan is a leading member of the coalition against Daesh. We are very much involved in Syria. Remember our pilot last year was caught by Daesh and who was put at the stakes? So we're very much involved there, and that's where our military is entirely focused. But just as a point of interest, just I want to enforce that. But other areas is really basically not in our interest, but we are fully focused on Syria. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those extra points. And finally, do we have a speech in abstention of the motion at all? Yes, there.
Hi, I'm Daniel from Queens. Neither side has addressed the issue of whether this House, relative to the world, should accept refugees. The UN definition of a refugee is a person who fears persecution, physical harm, or even death in his own country. But most of the refugees who are traveling through Europe are not facing death in Hungary. They're not facing death in France, in Calais. And so why should we not spend the money to save 20 refugees, to help 20 refugees in Turkey relative to 5 refugees in Britain?
Thank you very much for your contribution, and indeed everyone's in that floor speech and the floor rounds as a whole this evening. Right. In the interest of keeping to time, I will now return to our main debate and back to the proposition. And our final speaker on the proposition this evening is Daniel Zeichner, who is was elected as the Labour MP for Cambridge in 2015. And he campaigned in support of the amendment that would have seen 3,000 refugee children brought to the UK before that was voted down in Parliament earlier this year. Daniel.
Thank you, Madam President, and Ambassador, friends, good evening. And first of all, can I say this is the first time I've actually spoken at the Union since I was elected last year. I've been here many times before. But particularly to freshers, welcome to Cambridge. I am your representative. There will be different views in the room, but I'll try and represent everybody. And if there's anything I can do in future, either catch me in a bar afterwards or talk to me on another occasion. Can I also say there may be some citizens of the European Union in the room, in which case this is your home. Welcome. And I'd like to pick up on... I see some saying it's cheap. I have to tell you that I was at an event earlier this evening with Adam Brooks Hospital who were telling me about the number of their workers who are feeling intimidated and frightened, and the levels of hate crime that are rising as a consequence of June the 23rd are shameful. But let me move on. And following on from that, and picking up Robert's comments about the generosity of the British people, let me say Cambridge is perhaps different from other places. When the crisis last year, and there have been crises for many years, but when it hit the headlines, Cambridge's response was generous and open and welcoming. And I pay tribute to the people, some of whom are in this room, for the work that's been done, just like Josie has been talking about, reaching out to the people in Calais, trying to do everything they can to help. And I know not everyone agrees with that, but many, many people in Cambridge do. And I believe we should be proud of it. And indeed, Cambridge is actually a city of sanctuary. When there was a particular furore a decade ago around asylum seekers, people actually had to even change the language because it had become so poisonous, partly because of some of the newspapers that we've had represented earlier today. This is a city of sanctuary, it's a positive, progressive city, and I am proud to represent it. Let me turn very briefly to some of the points that have been made, as this is kind of summary and response. I listened closely to the contributions on the other side. I wasn't entirely sure what questions some of them were addressing, particularly the first speaker. But in every case, what they were doing was eliding the subject of refugees with the issue of immigration, somehow suggesting that some individual tragedies that we absolutely have to address would mean an open door to millions and millions of people. And it's the trick that is played constantly, particularly in the popular newspapers, and it's a complete misunderstanding of the situation. And actually, Alistair MacLeod, in his opening sentence, elided refugees and immigration, thus completely letting the game away, effectively. And I was struck by Mr. Dalrymple's point, and I'm looking forward to working with him. Sorry, Dalrymple. I look forward to working with you in the next few days, because I think what you were saying was that asylum seekers and refugees should work, should set up businesses. Well, this has been one of the key issues that your papers and others have been determinedly campaigning against. So I will work with you to try and make this happen in future. What a good idea. And well, you know exactly what I'm talking about. What we've been short on in this entire debate tonight actually is some accuracy and facts about the situation. And that is what I want to finish on in a moment. I'm conscious that time will pass. But I did also want to pick up some of the very good points that were made from the floor. I'm just trying to... Oh yes, Akir, think from Selwyn, said that the people should be consulted. Well, I think, to be fair, that's what we have general elections for, you know. That is what happens. The people are consulted on a regular basis. And certainly on the basis of the referendums that we've seen recently, I would rather stick to general elections in future. I think it's a better way, absolutely. And I hope it is a general election soon and we get a Labour government, we'll get a more sensible setup, well, you mock, but I'll tell you what, if we get close to an election and Labour looks like winning, I guess these guys will be in a state of panic, and then you'll see how British democracy really works. But never mind, let's wait until we get closer to that. The points from I'm a Kingsman, and my fellow from Kings, you're right, Yemen is a disgraceful situation. It's complicated, it's perhaps not the subject of the debate tonight, but it seemed to me you made a very fair and reasonable point. I'm not going to be able to respond to all the people that raised points, but I think it's right that some are referenced in the final points. I'd just like to talk in my last couple of minutes about what's happened in Parliament, because obviously I represent you in Parliament. I was in the chamber on the day when David Cameron responded to huge public pressure, rightly so, because people were absolutely heartbroken and appalled by the scenes they were seeing in the Mediterranean. And I have to say, when David Cameron announced what Britain was going to do, 20,000 refugees over 5 years, there was an audible gasp that went round the chamber, not just on the Labour benches. People like Heidi Allen, who's a good campaigner on the Conservative benches and a neighbour here. People were genuinely shocked that Britain was doing so little. Had we known, of course, that even that little was not going to be kept to, that a year later, after the Dubs Amendment, we would still be in the shameful position of doing so little. I think it's an absolute disgrace. So there are many people in Parliament who will keep on fighting and fighting and fighting on this. And I will just finish on the point of law. Actually, this is not a difficult motion to vote on, because Britain is still, even with our current government, I believe, respectful of the international agreements that we've signed up to. We are a signatory to the convention, 1951 convention, and on refugees it is absolutely clear. It's not about an open door policy. If people present, and the rules, there's a whole series of qualifications, but they present as refugees, it's not a question of whether we want to or not. We have an obligation to take people, and it's absolutely right and proper that we do. So don't get distracted by the immigration question. We can have a debate another evening about immigration, and there are big issues around that. But do not be led down this false track that people on the other side will always do, of trying to push the two things together. And in the end, we've heard a lot of figures tonight, a lot of figures. We've heard about countries, 20% of their population are refugees. Shall I tell you what the refugee population is in this country? Actually, when pollsters go out, particularly from the Mail and the Telegraph, and ask people, you'll find the numbers are reckoned to be rather high. Actually, 0.04%. 0.04%. Your country ambassador, 20%. We are a great country. We're a wealthy country. In my view, we can do much, much better.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for bringing our proposition bench to a close this evening. And I now turn to our final speaker for the opposition and indeed the debate as a whole. Roger Helmer is an MEP for the East Midlands, and he has been so since 1999. He currently represents UKIP since defecting from the Conservatives in 2012. And he's an old Cambridge man, having read mathematics here at Churchill College. Roger.
Madam President, Your Excellency, everybody. Yes, I'm Roger from Churchill. And I'd like to start by commenting on some of the things the last speaker said. You said some of the people in the room may be European citizens. I thought all of us who were British, and plus those from the continent, were all European citizens. We haven't left the European Union yet. So I think it's about 95% of us, probably. You were also very concerned about us eliding, it's a good word, I like it, eliding, refugees with migrants. And you were saying we shouldn't be carried away by talk of millions. Well, of course, Angela Merkel's been carried away by a million, as it were. In fact, the United Nations says that there are about 20 million people around the world who are displaced persons or refugees. So to tell us there aren't millions potentially involved is, I think, misleading. But I would also like to come back, if I may, to Robert, who was telling us that, in fact, the German people love immigration. They welcome immigrants at the station with gifts and signs and so on. And he's found much the same about the British people. Well, I've got to tell you, Robert, I was part of the Brexit campaign. I must have knocked on thousands of doors. And the biggest single concern that people on the doorstep had, and this wasn't me raising it, it was them raising it to me, it was immigration again and again and again, the biggest single concern that they had.
I think you were lying.
Look at Angela Merkel in Germany. You say that she is reflecting the will of the people who are generous and welcoming. Why have her opinion poll ratings fallen completely out of bed? Why is she rushing now to reverse that policy? We've heard an awful lot of compassion tonight coming from the other side, and I would tell you there is a certain amount of compassion on this side. The only thing is our compassion is moderated to an extent by practicality and what is possible to do. Of course we look at the situation in Syria and we are appalled. It's natural we want to help fellow humans in distress. Josie's already asked us to consider, and this is an example I like, what would we do if we found a starving child on our doorstep in the morning? Of course we would feed it, you're absolutely right. Suppose we found a dozen starving children on our doorstep. We'd do our best, we'd get the neighbours to rally round. Supposing we found thousands of starving children on our doorstep, we would phone the civil authority. Numbers actually matter. We can be compassionate with reasonable numbers. We cannot cope with millions. I would like to turn. The questioner over there referred to UKIP promoting xenophobia. For the avoidance of doubt, let me just tell you what the position of UKIP on immigration is. We are not against immigration, and we are most emphatically not against immigrants. We recognise the important contribution which immigrants have made and must continue to make to our culture and our economy. But we also recognise the pressures that mass immigration places on social cohesion and social infrastructure, on housing, on hospital, on schools. I will quote Milton Friedman, who said, "You can have open borders or you can have free welfare, but you cannot have both at the same time." And we know that those who suffer most from the next wave of immigration are the last wave of immigrants. What my party wants is exactly what most independent countries have, a managed immigration policy which brings in the skills our country needs and at a level which our economy and our social infrastructure can sustain. In fact, our immigration policy, far from being discriminatory, is actually less discriminatory than the immigration policy under UK and EU rules that exist today. The existing policy favours European citizens who are for the most part white, and therefore it involves clamping down aggressively on non-Europeans, many of whom are non-white. We want a colourblind policy based solely on numbers and skills. I have often said that I would prefer to admit an Indian dentist or a Chinese engineer rather than an unskilled European. But most of all, we recognise that we live in a democracy. I trust that no one in this room has any problem with that. And we are fast reaching the limits of democratic tolerance for immigration, not just in the UK, but across Europe. In the UK and elsewhere, the liberal establishment has sought to choke off debate on immigration by shouting racist from the rooftops whenever the subject is mentioned. But those of us, as I've said, engaged in day-to-day politics know it's a critical issue on the doorstep. We in my party claim some credit for having taken this issue and brought it into the public square. And now virtually all UK politicians, with the possible exception of Jeremy Corbyn, recognise the problem. It is neither wrong nor racist for politicians to debate the issues that matter to their voters, and we make no apology for doing so. But we're seeing a similar paradigm shift across Europe. In Germany, Angela Merkel adopted essentially the policy in this motion, let them all come, with disastrous political consequences. It may well be that the great majority of migrants, refugees and economic migrants are decent, law-abiding people. Yet there are enough who are not to cause real concerns to the indigenous populations. Many of these migrants bring with them cultural attitudes, not least towards women and gays, which are unacceptable in Western society. The offences committed against women in Germany, which we heard about from the back row over there, hardly bear repeating, although they were repeated. Some migrants bring with them the feuds and vendettas of their homelands and expect to pursue those feuds and vendettas in European cities. And a few, but a very dangerous few, will be deliberately spreading jihad and seeking to commit bombings and outrages in our country. That has happened already. This is not idle speculation of what might happen. As the public see this, as they see the overcrowding and the pressure brought by sheer numbers, compassionate democratic consent crumbles away in the face of intractable problems. I should like to briefly discuss one country, not Germany, which has also adopted a policy of universal welcome. Sweden has always prided itself on its generous and liberal attitude towards migrants. If it was difficult to discuss immigration in the UK, over in Sweden it was practically the sin against the Holy Ghost. Those who dared put their heads above the parapet, like our colleagues from the Swedish Democrats, were howled down and denied media access. Yet in 2015, Sweden accepted 30% more immigrants pro rata than even Germany itself. I recently saw pictures in social media of cars burning in Malmö. So in our group meeting in Brussels, I expressed my sympathy to Swedish MEP Peter Lundgren for the outrage. I was astonished by his response. Which outrage, he said. The riots in Malmö, I said. Oh, that, he said. But it is happening all the time in Sweden. The attitudes of acute political correctness survive. Swedish media are reluctant to report riots and offences involving migrants. Swedish police are reluctant to pursue illegals lest it seem inhumane. The authorities allowed 35,000 so-called children to enter Sweden in 2015 with no age checks, though it was widely believed that a significant proportion were young adults eager to benefit from the children's more favourable terms. In 2015, the municipality of Malmö received and registered 15,000 unaccompanied minors, or claimed minors, more than the whole of Germany accepted. Sweden now has 55 no-go zones where access to the police, the fire and security services, even the postal service, are severely restricted. But of course, the Swedish people are not fools. Despite establishment attempts to keep a lid on the issue, we see the Swedish Democrats now leading the opinion polls, while other parties reluctantly scramble to adopt part of their programme. In Germany, as in Sweden, we see that an open-door policy lacks democratic consent. It cannot be sustained whether we want it or not. My colleagues have already mentioned that Britain provides a very large amount of aid to support refugees who are remaining closer to their country of origin. I believe, in pro rata terms, we are the largest contributors. So if we want to do our virtue signalling, if we want to feel compassionate, that is what we are able to do. An open door policy is simply unsustainable if Mrs. Lumsden in Gasworks Row and millions of other voters like her are not prepared to accept it. I urge the House to reject the motion.
Thank you so much, Roger, for closing tonight's debate as a whole. So that does indeed conclude tonight's debate. Thank you so much for coming this evening. Just a few housekeeping notices from me. On Saturday evening, we will be hosting our annual Freshers' Ball for new life members to the union. It should be fantastic fun. Unfortunately, if you have not yet got your ticket online, you may have some problems because I believe it is now sold out. So hopefully you all got a ticket before the debate this evening. And then on Sunday, we will be welcoming the legendary film director Oliver Stone to the union. He will be here at 3 p.m. So if you're at the ball, make sure you've brushed off your hangover before that happens, and come down to the union for what will be an excellent event, and he will be here to talk about his upcoming film, Snowden. So, the motion before you this evening is this House would open its doors to refugees. The House will now divide, and in traditional fashion, we vote with our feet. If you are voting in favour of the motion, please exit through the door on the right. If you're voting against the motion, please exit through the door on your left. And if you would like to abstain, please leave through the middle. The results will be announced shortly afterwards in the bar. If you could please let the speakers leave first so there is not a blockage, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much.